been given a draft notice the 2 days after graduation. I was to report for the Army, but I enlisted in the Air Force the day after graduation and spent 4 years in the Air Force making movies. Kind of a long story there, but essentially I had met a conservatory student, Gerald Hummel, and we wrote several operas together. I wrote the librettos, he wrote the music, and he joined the Air Force and sent for me to come to Washington because he was in a barracks with a movie company that was forming. So I took my spring vacation to go talk to the movie company, a major who was the head of the movie company, and I took my sample book of writing and pictures and so on, and he took one quick look at it and said, okay, well, you join the Air Force and I'll see that you get here. So after graduation, I enlisted in the Air Force and went through basic training, and after waiting around for a couple of extra weeks, I got summoned to Alexandria, Virginia, where the Air Force movie company was, and I discovered that the major who had requested me was no longer there. He had made somebody angry in the Pentagon and was fired clean out of the command. So here I was joining the writing department of what was then called the 1st Combat Camera Unit, which I thought was a very glamorous thing to belong to. Combat, after all, is what war is all about. Well, they quickly changed the name to the 1350th Photographic Squadron, which is a higher class name, obviously, but not as glamorous as the 1st Combat Camera Unit.
When you were in college, you knew a guy named Donald Henderson. Tell me about Donald Henderson.
After I arrived at Oberlin, I discovered that they had a yearbook staff and that they published a very large yearbook. Well, I had edited the yearbook in my high school and learned most of the graphic arts connected with production of yearbooks. So I looked up the staff and joined the yearbook. Well, Donald A. Henderson was an executive editor at that time. And
is there a door at the top of the steps?
Beg pardon?
Is there a door at the top of the steps?
Yes, you could close that.
I'm going to shut the door.
Oh.
Sorry, it's not distracting when we're talking,
No, that's
but
all
I
right.
know the dishes rattling will show up in the audio.
Oh.
You tell
Do you want me to backtrack?
Yes, backtrack to Donald Henderson.
All right. Shortly after I arrived at Oberlin, I realized that there was a yearbook published every year there, and I learned that there was a yearbook staff. And having edited our high school yearbook, I was familiar with all the processes of cropping photographs, scaling type, and so on. So I volunteered, and I was put under the tutelage of an assistant editor by the name of Donald Henderson. And he and I worked together, and it turns out that he was going to be the editor the following year, and he had his eye on me to become the editor the year after he was the editor. So I worked through various positions on the yearbook staff. And my senior year, I roomed with D.A. Henderson. Well, he wanted to become a public health physician. And I said, why would you want to do that? Why not be a regular doctor? He said, well, he said, can you imagine what the most celebrated medical advance in the world is? And I said, well, I don't suppose it's the iron lung. This was before the Salk vaccine. He said, no, it's soap and water. But D.A. Henderson was the most practical person I ever knew. He was able to take an idea and immediately see the idea on into the future and over the horizon. After I'd been at Oberlin for a few years, I said, you know, we ought to have a radio station here. And he said, well, if you're going to do a radio station, the first thing you have to do is to find some electronic people here who are probably into amateur radio. You have to recruit the technical staff first if you're going to get anywhere. Then you probably have to talk it over with the president of the college, because if he's against the idea, you won't get it anywhere. And he could see this whole progression of what needed to be done in sequence way beyond what I could do. And I admired his ability to do that. Well, after a while, he became a public health doctor, and the next thing I knew, he had teamed up with a public health statistician, and they figured out that they could eliminate smallpox in our time, which was an unheard of large feat. But one day on a vacation, I visited him, and he said, well, we really had to start from scratch. We asked how small a dose can you have to vaccinate people with smallpox? And the doctor said, we don't know, ask the vaccine manufacturer. And they didn't know either. So we started a program to find out that you could dilute the vaccine about 1,000 to 1 from what it was being given. And therefore the production of sufficient vaccine to vaccinate the world was possible. Then the question was, could you make enough needles to inject smallpox vaccine into the world? And the answer was no. But, however, during World War II, the Army had used some pneumatic guns to vaccinate people, hundreds of them in a line, in a matter of seconds. So we revived that technology, and then we realized that we had to train teams to do this. So then we started a large training exercise and set it in motion. By this time, the UN funded this program. And in about 3 years, he and the team had eliminated smallpox in the world. The only smallpox now is in a refrigerator at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He went on to become the dean of the Johns Hopkins Medical School. He died a while back, but he was one of the people who really influenced me as I was growing up in the world, and I think it helped me to learn to plan the way he could.
It sounds like the smallpox vaccination program went a lot better than the coronavirus vaccination program went.
Well, they already had the vaccine, so that was a big step. And you know, of course, during the coronavirus effort, they had to develop the vaccine from a standing start. So that was a different part. The mobilization, however, was a logistical nightmare because vaccinating the world, even though there were hot spots in Africa and a few other countries, was a big undertaking. And I think he won the Nobel Prize for doing that.
How long were you in the Air Force? Like 4 years?
Yes, you had to enlist for 4 years. At that time, if you were drafted, you had to serve for 2 years, but they could extend your term of service. And I thought, since I had the assurance of being in a movie unit, that would be combining of both writing and my artistic interest. And indeed, it has always been useful to carry that forward from college into making movies, and from there into industrial advertising.
Your BA was in practice of art.
Yes. Practice of art.
Were you stationed in various different places while you were in the Air Force? Where are some of the places you were stationed?
Well, I started basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. From there, I went to Alexandria, Virginia, where the 1st Combat Camera Unit was located in a historic brick building down near the Naval Torpedo Plant along the Potomac River. And I was there for about 1.5 years, and then 13 of us were detached from that squadron and sent to New York City. So I spent about 18 months in New York City making 13 or 15 episodes of the Air Force story. Then our unit was transferred to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, here in Dayton, Ohio. And I spent the rest of the 5 years here making technical films.
Your NSS number 1999. When did you join the NSS?
Joined the NSS in late June or early July of 1955. 1999, it seemed to me a very high number at the time, but it's a very low number now because most of the people have come and gone in the NSS, and the number is up in the tens of thousands. In 1954, at the C3 expedition of the NSS, I ended up writing a book called Caves Beyond with Joe Lawrence, and at the end of handing in the manuscript, they wanted to know what I wanted in compensation, and I said, I don't want anything except a honorary membership or a life membership. And that cost $75 at the time, so I was granted a life membership in the 1955 NSS convention. Well, they don't usually figure that people are going to live as long as I did, so they've lost a ton of money on me.
You were involved with the Met Grotto at some point, probably when you were stationed in New York. Tell me about your time at the Met Grotto.
When I joined the NSS in Arlington, Virginia, I didn't know there were groups, but gradually, as I read the newsletter and was assigned to New York City, I realized there was a grotto in New York City and that they met at a certain restaurant. So my wife and I went to that restaurant one night, and there was a gang of maybe 20 people there that explored caves. So they were talking about the next cave trip they were going to go on, and we went on the cave trip. After going on several of these weekend cave trips, we got to know a lot of people at the grotto. Turns out they wanted to start a newsletter, and so I volunteered to be the editor of the newsletter. And we put out, I don't know, maybe 10 or 11 newsletters. They were mimeographed using the high technology in which instead of making a stencil mechanically by typing on the stencil, you could have the thing pasted up and the thing scanned onto a mimeograph stencil, so you could have pictures, and it was a step up from the old mimeograph. That word is at risk. It's a spam call. Probably the dark web people.
Haven't paid your dues lately to the dark web.
Oh, at any rate, I was talking about the Met Grotto, and we went on a number of trips, and I met a fellow from New Jersey who was interested in making a movie in a cave, and we were, some friends and I were downtown in Manhattan making movies, so we joined him and told him we knew all about making movies, and so we made a movie, 16mm movie called The Spelunker. And scenes from that movie still appear. I saw one the other day on a National Geographic film. It was a shot taken from a side passage. The light is out in the passage. Somebody's going by and stepping in water and splashing. That was one of the scenes out of that movie. Stolen, of course, and I suppose I could sue them for $1 million.
Al Holstrunk was the guy who worked on the Spelunker movie with you.
Yes.
You were it says that you wrote the script.
Yeah.
And he I have some notes about it. In 1954 at the COG Speleofest, there was a note that says 64 spelunkers from all over Ohio and Indiana joined to Ohio Caverns to attend the Central Ohio Grotto Speleo Festival, April 24 to 25, 1954. The group then settled back to watch a sneak preview of the new cave movie, The Spelunker, being produced by Bill Holstrunk of the EDS Grotto, and later on it says that you wrote the script for it. That was in 1954.
I wrote the script, and we produced a pilot film to learn something about the lighting techniques in caves. We were familiar with Hollywood movies where the cowboys ride into the cave, and of course there are lights all over the cave, or a mine generally, and everything we saw, there was light everywhere, and of course darkness is one of the elements of a real cave. So we thought, well, you can buy surplus aircraft landing lights very cheaply, run them on a battery, and if you have two of them, you can have a key light and a fill light. But by using them, very carefully, you can have a lot of dark in the picture, and that was the ability to get.
I know it gets frustrating. Don't worry about it.
The ability to get natural lighting in a cave, you'd say, well, that's impossible because it's dark. But no, natural lighting in a cave is mobile because it's on the head of everybody's hard hat. So with the aircraft landing lights, you could move the light around and pick up shadows and really get some cave-like lighting effects, which we may have been some of the early people who figured this out. But you still see videos and movies of people in caves in which the lighting comes from some mysterious other place.
So by the time this cave was organized, you'd already moved back to Ohio to Wright-Patterson.
Yes. And we recorded the soundtrack at Antioch College with a piano and a drum set in one of the large buildings in Antioch. We set up and scored the film there.
The EDS Grotto was like an unaffiliated caving club before it became an official grotto. Do you remember anything about that?
Well, I don't know what EDS stands for. The New Jersey Grotto is Bill Holstrunk and his brother belonged to this New Jersey Grotto. I don't know whether it's called EDS or what, but
Okay.
we regularly went with members of that group caving in upstate New York and eastern Pennsylvania and places like that.
The website for the Met Grotto says that there was a newsletter starting in, I think, in '52, but they didn't have any copies of it online, but that it existed.
Really?
But I emailed them to see if they had any copies of. I was curious to see what some of the newsletters looked like back then. But
Well, I can't tell you about 1965. I was well entrenched in Ohio.
this was
by
in
that
1952. It was
time.
when they started. Then in '52, you were in Alexandria, Virginia. In late '52, the Central Ohio Grotto was formed.
Yes.
Were you involved with the initial parts of the Central Ohio Grotto?
Yes. Phil Smith, who was the first president of the Cave Research Foundation, and Roger McClure, who is has been with the Cave Research Foundation for a long time, came down from Springfield, Ohio, when they saw that I had landed in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and they were starting to form a grotto, which they described as having 2 or 3 friends, and I joined at that time, and the grotto applied for grotto status from the NSS and became an official grotto. Well, we recruited a lot of people who went caving. We undertook the Ohio Cave Survey, which was to try to survey all of the caves in Ohio. Well, it turns out that the first half dozen caves in Ohio are mud holes, very small, hardly anything you'd want to visit a second time. That project eventually withered away when Jim Dyer came along and took us to Indiana caves, and suddenly we realized that there are caves that are bigger than Ohio caves, more interesting. And then on Thanksgiving of 1953, Jim Dyer arranged for a trip for Phil Smith, Roger McClure, and Roger Brucker to go to Crystal Cave, Floyd Collins Crystal Cave, and meet the celebrated Bill Austin. And he was going to take us into the Lost Passage in Crystal Cave. Well, we went down there. It was a long drive. There were no interstate highways at that time. It took you maybe 12 or 13 hours to drive from Ohio down to Cave City, Kentucky. At any rate, we got there, and Jim Dyer had a terrible cold, and he got sicker and sicker, and he couldn't go on this trip. Bill Austin said, well, I've got to manage the cave today, which was Saturday, and we can go in around 6 o'clock in the evening. So we said, what do we need to do to get ready? We brought a rope. Do we need that? Oh, yes, you better bring the rope. This was a 3/4-inch manila rope. And what about food? Should we take food? Yes, take food. Well, I brought some crackers because I think that food needs to be lightweight. He said, oh, that'd be fine. And how about cheese? Well, yeah, cheese would be fine. So this was just totally inappropriate cave food in hindsight, but at any rate, that's what we did. And then finally, Austin took us into the cave, and that was the origin of the rinky-dink as far as I was concerned. And Phil Smith and Roger McClure, we were not used to going fast in a cave, and Bill Austin would take off running ahead, and it was all we could do to keep anywhere near him. And after a while, it seemed to us that he was showing off, that he could cave, and we were the amateurs from Ohio. And he was equipped with golf spikes, and we were not. So every time we'd catch up to him, he would take off, and we said, we better keep going, or we're going to be left behind and lost. So after several hours, we ended up in the Lost Passage in Crystal Cave, and I unwrapped the crackers. Well, the crackers were nothing but crumbs. They had been crushed to pieces in this trip. The manila rope was used at one place, and I think we abandoned it. It was too heavy to carry, and the manila rope had parts of the thing would stick out and penetrate your skin, so that it wasn't very useful. But the big thing about that trip was that Austin had prepared a spaghetti dinner down there in the passage, and so the food we brought was useless by that time. The cheese was full of gravel and rocks. But the spaghetti dinner was the best thing we had ever eaten in our lives in Floyd Collins' kitchen. We saw Floyd's bean cans, rusty tin cans with a few old spilled beans around them. Well, then we went out of the cave by a different route, and I remember arriving at one place and said, I recognize this. How in the world did we get here? Because we haven't recovered we haven't gone over old ground before. And I think that was the first time I recognized that this cave was huge, that probably nobody could ever memorize their way through this cave. It was so complex. And of course, by that time, we had been mapping the caves in southern Ohio. So obviously mapping the cave was the way to understand a big cave. Bill Austin had done some mapping. He once showed us one of his maps, which was kind of a line drawing with stations on the map and straight lines connecting it, nothing that would indicate what the passage size was. And nowhere did we understand where any of his maps were. So we began to work on Crystal Cave, and that led eventually to the Cave Research Foundation and to an ongoing program which is still going on today.